Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Colin joins me to discuss Node.js, and we might get to a little bit of Dino here at the end, but we'll see how much time we got here today. So the first place I'd like to start here, Colin, is just going over a bit of your story on kind of your development career and kind of how you got to where you are today.
I've been working on Node.js for, going on 10 years now, working with Node.js even longer than that. And it all kind of started back in 2014. I was hired to work at Walmart, which was the team that was doing Happy.js and Black Friday and all of that stuff. So for the people who might be newer to Node, this was 2013, 2014. Node was only a couple years old. It wasn't everywhere yet. So the fact that it was being used somewhere like Walmart to handle Black Friday traffic was actually a pretty big deal for the technology. And so when I started working there, I was working with, some people who were well known in the Node community. And I felt like I needed to kind of prove myself a little bit. So I started just contributing to the Node core project, and things just kind of snowballed from there. So after a while of contributing, I was invited to join the technical steering committee. There was a fork involved. There was the whole IO.js thing back in the day, and then the two projects coming back together in the Node Foundation, which is now the OpenJS Foundation. And so I've, since I left Walmart, I've worked at some other big Node companies, Nearform, Joyent. I've had jobs that had my complete focus was working on Node.js. I've also had jobs where it was 0% of my job, and I would just do things on nights and weekends for fun. That's pretty much been my journey as far as Node.js goes.
Gotcha. So you've been involved with Node for really the last 10 years or so, and kind of even contributing to Node and different things like that. So this definitely knows a ton more than me when it comes to Node. And I think maybe a good place for us to start here, kind of transitioning in to our topic of today, is what is Node.js? Like, if someone's a little bit newer to JavaScript development, maybe their frame of JavaScript is just JavaScript runs in the browser, but that's maybe not the only place JavaScript can run. So what kind of is Node.js? And then we'll kind of get into some other features and different things like that from there.
Yeah. So, assuming that you are familiar with programming and know what JavaScript itself is, Node.js is basically running JavaScript outside of the browser. So normally that's in a server environment, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Depending on how you classify things, there's also things like function as a service. So things like Lambda, which you can run your server there, but it's not your typical like VM or container environment. So I guess I forget what the rest of the question was.
So basically just what is Node.js? So to me, it sounds like Node.js is basically just running JavaScript, not in the browser, in more of a server environment, but it also sounds like there are other areas that aren't always technically classified as what someone would think of as a server in kind of more of an edge runtime or something like that as well. Does that sound correct?
Yep. And Node is, I guess, probably the biggest and most well-known. It was not the first JavaScript runtime outside of the browser. Nowadays there's certainly a handful of them, Dino and Bon, and ones that you could classify as also being JavaScript runtimes.
Gotcha. And is it safe to say that Node.js is still the most popular of JavaScript runtimes outside of the browser? I know there is definitely some excitement with Dino and some new ones, but my understanding is that Node still kind of dominates in terms of use across current applications. Is that correct?
So that's my understanding as well. I put together a chart for a talk I gave 2 weeks ago at Node Tel Aviv. I basically took the raw download numbers from nodejs.org and turned them into graphs. And I think we were averaging around 4 to 4.5 million downloads every 7 days, or maybe it was per day every 7 days. And I don't know what the download numbers for Dino and Bon are. I assume that they're getting bigger, but I don't think that they're that big yet.
Yeah, that's my understanding of things as well. So I think with that kind of sets things up nicely for what Node is, and it's definitely what we think is the most popular currently. I would be very surprised if anything has surpassed it at this point. But with that, what are maybe some features of Node.js in which it makes it like a good option for people to use as kind of on their server side?
So on the server side I think it was originally designed to be server side. So there's a lot of good options. We do have, HTTP, HTTPS, HTTP2, and coming soon or soon-ish, Quick, which is more or less HTTP3. So we do have all of these networking protocols. UDP is another one I forgot, built into Node right out of the box. And then there's a huge, package ecosystem on NPM that kind of builds on top of all these other things. So, web frameworks like Happy, which I'm a big fan of, Fastify. A lot of people still use Express, but you should probably not do that anymore. And there are other ones. But there's a huge ecosystem, several million packages that all build on top of the core modules that ship with Node. So really anything that you would want to do on the server, there's a really, really good chance that it's either, shipped out of the box with Node or is available on NPM. Somebody's already done the work for you.
Are there any particular kind of features of Node.js that someone should be maybe aware of when they're coming from maybe a more of a front-end focus point? So are there any particular features that are a lot different when writing JavaScript within Node compared to writing JavaScript within the browser? Or can you mostly use a lot of the similar features between the two? Or what should maybe someone know if they're going from kind of JavaScript in the browser compared to running it in a Node environment?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. And the answer to that has been evolving over years. So, today everybody wants to be able to take their JavaScript code, run it on the server, run it in the client, wherever, and just have one piece of JavaScript code that runs everywhere. And a lot of the newer runtimes, Dino being the first one that comes to mind here, really pride themselves on saying, we're compatible with the browsers. We do everything the same way the browser would do.
Mm-hmm.
And Node, it has over time started to gravitate to that approach as well. The key difference there is when you're starting on day one, it's easy to say, okay, I'm going to do whatever the browser is doing. When you're already, a decade in, and Node existed for years before a lot of these APIs in the browser even existed. Like Node kind of, I would say, pioneered some of these APIs, and then later things were added to the browser. And so that's why you get, kind of these weird hiccups like the whole CommonJS and ESM thing, which, really loves, but it's just part of life at this point. Another really good one is the set timeout API, which is, a very, very common API. Nodes is not technically spec compliant. So in the browser, set timeout returns a number. In Node.js, it returns an object that you can then do things with. So there are still differences, but I would say as time is moving on, we are much more closely trying to follow what browsers and standards are doing.
Mm-hmm. And that has to be tricky as well, as the browser is constantly adding new features and updating things and kind of extending it. So when kind of thinking about development for Node, does Node kind of, I'm guessing that they pay pretty close attention to different features that are added to different browsers. And then there's also the potential problem of different browsers support different things and might have slightly different behaviors between browsers as well. So is there like a standard that Node follows to where like maybe it looks at different features that Chrome is adding and then it tries to add those, or what does it kind of do when it comes to new development there?
Yeah, so there are multiple standards. So there's there's ECMAScript itself, which is TC39 is the governing body that kind of defines what the JavaScript language is. That luckily for us in Node, that gets implemented by V8. So that's the JavaScript engine that is inside of Chrome. And so, as far as following the spec there, that's kind of out of our hands. A lot of people have issues asking for features and things like that, and we can redirect them elsewhere because it's not really under our purview. That's one spec. And then there are other groups like the working group, WHATWG, which define a lot more of the browser standards and things like that. And then historically, they've kind of been more skewed towards the front end, and environments like Node have kind of been an afterthought. But in, I think it was 2022, a new working group called the Winter CG was created. And that's basically focusing on web interoperable runtimes. So those are essentially Node, Deno, Bun, all of the things that aren't browsers. So it's a place for those environments to kind of come together and, talk about and kind of agree on what they would like to do. And then they can, kind of agree amongst themselves that we're going to do things a certain way, go back to these other standards bodies and kind of, say, this is what we would like to present as our opinion on these things. And so that, that's, like I said, that's a newer thing, but it's something that gives environments like Node more of a voice in how these standards are evolving. But yes, there are people who pay very close attention to the standards, people who, sit on these standards bodies and things like that, who are part of, the Node project. So I would say we definitely have our ears very tuned into those things.
Yeah. I could definitely imagine. And there definitely would have to be like quite a bit of coordination, I would feel like, between kind of Node and browser runtimes and all these kind of different things kind of coming together into one of those standards there. So yeah, that's very cool. And I would say one of the kind of practical takeaways for me is that, if someone's trying to do something in Node that they usually do in the browser, and it's kind of acting a little weirdly or acting a little bit differently, it might just be an aspect or a result of just a slightly different implementation in the Node runtime compared to the browser runtime, and making sure to maybe consult the Node docs on how some specific feature works. Would you say that that's a fair takeaway there?
Yeah, check the docs. But also there's always the chance that it's a bug in Node. So, go to the issue tracker, try to do a search before you start opening issues. Because if it's a common enough thing, there's a chance that it's already been discussed. There could even be a fix, underway, or maybe you have an older version of Node and it's fixed in a newer version. But if you think that there's some discrepancy there that shouldn't be there, it's at least worth surfacing to the Node team. It might get fixed.
Yeah, awesome. And you kind of mentioned versioning there, and I know that Node has like latest, I think it's LTS, latest stable version, something along those lines, and then it also has like just latest version in general. When it comes to versioning, what do you kind of recommend that developers use? Do you recommend that they're kind of fine to just use the latest version, or would you kind of push them towards the latest stable version, or what should someone be considering there when maybe starting a new project and deciding on the version of Node to use?
Yeah, so Node has multiple release lines. The way it works is we have our main branch in GitHub where everything lands, breaking changes, patches, new features, whatever. And then all of the different release lines, so that's Node 16, Node 18, Node 19, 20, whatever. Those are all just separate Git branches, which people then cherry pick the appropriate commits back to, and then run some CI and do the whole release process. So those are the different release lines, and we create 2 new ones each year. So every April there'll be a new even numbered release. Every October there'll be a new odd numbered release. So the odd numbered releases, they're fun to play with for 6 months or so, but then they quickly go end of life. The even numbered releases, they're interesting because they become what's known as our current release for the first 6 months of their life. And what that means is that they are basically receiving all the patches from the main branch except for what we know to be breaking changes. Sometimes things slip through that shouldn't, and bugs happen. But for the most part, that's the way it works. But then after that 6 months of being the current release, then they transition into what's called active LTS, or long-term support. And they have that status for a year. And once they transition into LTS, it's kind of expected that, the rate of changes there will slow down. Changes kind of have to go out in another release, whatever our current is. and prove that they're stable for, 1 or 2 releases before they get backported to LTS. And that gives us stability for these huge enterprises who might be doing millions of dollars in transactions through Node.js. Don't want to just get a random bug and things break. And so after a year of LTS, then they go into what's called maintenance mode for, I believe it's 18 months. And at that point, things slow down even more. So there's going to be fewer patches backported, kind of like security and high impact things only. And then once maintenance period is over, they go end of life. There's no more updates, no more security patches, nothing. You kind of need to migrate off of them at that point. And so back to the original question of what to run, developers always want to run the latest and greatest. They want, new shiny feature. They're like, oh, I want to play with it. And they want to run it in production. You shouldn't do that unless you absolutely have to. I always say you should aim for an even numbered version that's already in active LTS or maintenance. It's going to be stable for you. It's going to, give you what you need. If you really want to try running the latest and greatest, knock yourself out. But if you want to live on the bleeding edge, sometimes there's blood. So, if you can move quickly, so if you can change your node version quickly, upgrade when things break, roll back if things break, then, feel free to do that. But the official recommendation is to always run an LTS version.
Yeah, and that's definitely the route I would lean towards, as well as I personally really hate getting into like versioning nightmare scenarios to where you have to go back versions and then that version's not compatible with some other package that you have. And then you're just in this like dependency hell that you're just scrambling for your life. There's definitely blood in that situation. So
yeah, I mean, even Node 20, which is, the latest and greatest right now, it's an even numbered release. In October, it's going to move into LTS. But there have definitely been hiccups with the Node 20 release, as far as, things like some new features we got, like happy eyeballs being turned on by default, the permission system, libuv, which is the C library that sits underneath of Node and does like the event loop and cross-platform async IO, things like that, moved over to using IO Uhring for certain operations, which gives these huge performance boosts on Linux. But there have been some hiccups with it interacting with Docker weirdly and things like that. So like, even though this is going to be an LTS release, eventually it's not yet. And so there have been issues.
Absolutely. And like you said, especially for a company that is doing, millions of dollars in transactions and is depending on these bugs not to occur, definitely becomes even more important at those points to make sure it is a more stable version. And kind of with that, like for you as kind of working on Node, do you feel a lot of pressure to like, not make any breaking changes and to make sure that, things are stable considering how many current applications are already using Node? And my guess would be some very, very large companies using Node. Is there kind of a sense of pressure there on the team, or are you guys just kind of like, well, we've been working on it for a long time. We know that this is just kind of the deal. So you just kind of move forward with that, or how do you kind of feel about that?
So the collaborators on the Node project are not, a homogenous group of people. We all have a lot of different opinions on things, and breaking changes and stability are definitely one of them. I think as far as those types of changes go, I lean more towards the conservative, not wanting to break things. I know there are people who are even more conservative than me and think that things should absolutely never have breaking changes. And then there are people who are on the opposite side of the spectrum who are kind of like, well, it's a major release, we're just going to break all the things. And, I think it's important to find a balance there, and we try to. Like I said, I would personally like to see fewer breaking changes, but, I'm one person out of however many people work on the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. Like there's definitely balance there to where I feel like for most projects, if you lean towards never pushing your code out there and potentially making a breaking change, then you end up just never shipping new versions. But then you also have the aspect of if you push things a little bit too early and you're constantly breaking things, then people aren't really going to want to use your software anymore. So I definitely think that finding a balance there is important.
Another thing worth pointing out specifically for new features is that we do have an experimental status. So if you look through the Node API docs, we have this stability index, and it'll say, either stable, experimental, deprecated. Another one is legacy, which is essentially like, it's deprecated, but we're not going to remove it. It's safe to keep relying on, but you should look for something better. But for experimental, these are, when we add new features, you kind of know that you're probably not going to get it right on the very first try. And so in Node 18, for example, I wrote a test runner for Node, and it went stable in Node 20. So we had a whole year to kind of, we were still free to break things as much as we wanted to. We could have actually completely ripped it out and said, we're not going to do this. And that's one of the things that comes with the experimental guarantees. There's not many guarantees. But that's one way we kind of try to address that is, so people know, like, hey, try this thing out. Don't bet your business on it at this point yet, but it's coming, it could be exciting. So that's an important one. Then the kind of the flip side of that is we have one new feature called a permission system that just came out recently. And it's an experimental feature, but it is specifically meant for security purposes. So if you look at the most recent Node 20 release, I think it was like 20.3.1 or something. It actually had a bunch of CVEs for the permission system because, we found all these bugs in them. But since it is specifically related to security, it's like, well, we kind of have to do a security release at this point. So that's kind of the one caveat is if it's security related. But yeah, the stability index is your friend when it comes to knowing what to use.
And you kind of mentioned there, experimental features, new features. So that kind of leads me into what can people kind of expect when they're thinking about potential new features that are coming soon to Node? Are there any features that you're like really excited about that you really want to see that they enter like a fully stable version of Node, or what's kind of coming soon to Node here?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the test runner. That was kind of my baby. So I enjoyed working on that. It's stable now. Another big one that came out recently is single executable applications. So the way that works is, if you say you want somebody to run your Node application, what you normally tell them to do is go install Node, make sure you have a package manager, NPM or whatever, NPM install all these things, and then you can run my package or my application. Mm-hmm. What a single executable does is it lets you take source code. Right now, it's a single common JS file, so you have to kind of bundle all of your stuff together in it first, or prove that. But you can take a piece of code and you can inject it into the Node binary itself. And then you can just have people say, download this binary. It already has everything you need built in, and then just run it. So, for deployments and, people who don't want to necessarily have NPM installed, it's a really great thing to have supported out of the box. That's a big one. I touched on the permission system. So, a lot of people are excited about it. Dino was, I think, the first to have it, but as somebody who had worked on Dino and Node, I never really loved it. I always felt like I was fighting against it. I feel like it's good for protecting your local development environment. But when you're going to production, you shouldn't really be relying on that as to save the day. I would rely on a much more battle-tested technology like containers or AWS Firecracker and things like that. That's how you should really be trying to lock down your environment. But, it's an extra layer. It doesn't really hurt. Other things that are coming, I think I mentioned Quick earlier. So the rate of development has kind of slowed down a bit on that, but, it's still being worked on actively and will be released someday. If you've ever done compiled add-ons, we have this thing called Node API. Well, back when we were originally laying out the plans for Node API, another alternative was FFI, which is foreign function interface that a lot of other languages support. And so we had decided to go with Node API, but just recently a contributor on his own just decided he was going to start implementing FFI. So it's work in progress. I don't know when or if it'll get finished, but that's something else that's coming down the line. Moving some of our existing core packages to support promises more natively is another thing. So like the FS module, the DNS module, things like that, they support promises out of the box. We still support the old legacy callback versions, but we want to have more of our built-in modules supporting that. Trying to think if there's anything else off the top of my head. Nothing's coming to mind right now. Better type integration.
Oh, there you go. I mean, that was a really good run through of new features coming. I can't believe you remembered all that off the top of your head in the first place. So I think that's really cool. And it definitely shows that, Node, it is an older like project, like it's better out of log tie, but like there's definitely still new development occurring and continuously extending the project. And, just because there's maybe other new potential solutions out there, like Dino doesn't make Node not a good solution. And kind of with that, maybe it's just like a final question here. If you were kind of just starting out here and you were wanting to learn either Node or let's just say Dino, one or the other, what route would you decide to go? And let's say that you also want to just maximize your job opportunities in the future. Which route would you go today? Would you kind of go down the Node route and kind of learn how that works? Or would you maybe go into the Dino ecosystem and kind of learn how that works?
I mean, this is in no way a diss of Dino at all, but at this point, I would still, if I was new to things and at least knew what I should be looking for, I would still lean towards Node. Just the simple fact of we have a long-term support schedule. That's a huge deal if you're working at a company. I can tell you, I was at Walmart when the Node and IOJS fork was going on. And we never even really considered using IOJS because things were moving too quickly. There were no stability guarantees. Companies really need things like that. As far as the technology goes, they're both built on top of V8. Dino wraps V8 in Rust and then builds everything with Rust. Node takes just V8 out of the box, which is C++, and kind of builds on top of that. They're both working towards, like I said earlier, web standards. So a lot of the APIs are going to be the same anyway. There are going to be some differences, but if you can pick up one, you can definitely pick up the other, especially as Dino has been, kind of leaning into supporting NPM packages and Node modules and things like that out of the box. The line between them is not that significant at this point.
Absolutely. And I feel very similar. Like if you know Node really well, my guess is that you could transition over into Dino pretty seamlessly, and underlying it, if you know JavaScript really well, that I think that you could pick up Node pretty well, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for coming on today, Colin. I definitely learned a ton about Node.js and different things to consider when transitioning from JavaScript runtimes, Node runtimes, and different things like that. So if people want to stay up to date with, you mentioned that a couple weeks ago you gave a talk. If people want to stay up to date with any talks that you're doing or other content you're maybe producing online, where can people kind of go to make sure that they're following that?
So 3 places would be Twitter, GitHub, and my own blog. They're all CJ Ihrig, CJIHRIG. That's my username, or cjihrig.com is my website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good day.